It's episode 125 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Please visit hankgarner.com and subscribe to the podcast. And while you're over at iTunes, please do me a favor and leave a review. It really helps other people find it and helps us increase in the rankings. Before we get to our writer's workshop today, here's a few messages from our sponsors. My friends over at the Self-Publishing Roundtable podcast have put together a special promo, and you can find it at selfpublishingroundtable.com/promo. There's also a link in the show notes. But what it is from September 28th to the 30th, a bunch of authors have gotten together and are offering a batch of free books for your reading pleasure. So are you looking for your next ebook boyfriend? How about over 100 for you to choose from? Or why not just choose them all? Like I said, from September 28th to the 30th, get romances of all flavors. They'll be free for your reading pleasure. Be sure to enter the drawing for a free Kindle Fire or Amazon gift cards as well. And you can find all that at selfpublishingroundtable.com/promo. Remember, that's from September 28th through the 30th. Swan's Night Sun by John C. Wright. John C. Wright is one of the living grandmasters of science fiction, and he won the 2016 Dragon Award for Best Science Fiction Novel at DragonCon. Folks said that this book is thoroughly entertaining, a YA novel for all ages who enjoy imaginative urban fantasy. I know you're going to love this book. Go out, pick a copy of it. There are links to it in the show notes. Also, Jaji Lamplighter brings us the unexpected enlightenment of Rachel Griffin. This story is about a magical girl detective. It's YA at its best. Think Fringe meets Narnia at Hogwarts. It's like Harry Potter, but better. Also, we always thank Ellen Campbell for being a faithful supporter of the show. Ellen is an editor. If you are a writer and need someone to help you shape your words into the very best they can be, there's none better than Ellen Campbell. You can find her at ellencampbell.thirdscribe.com, and please let her know that you heard about her on the Author Stories podcast. And when you're there, look at the roster of authors that she's worked with. All of the authors on this show that you're listening to today have been edited by the one and only Ellen Campbell. That's ellencampbell.thirdscribe.com. And then Dave Freer brings us two books this week that he would like to bring to your attention. Tom is a lighthearted and gently satirical fantasy that tells the story of a cat that is turned into a human. It takes all the typical fantasy tropes and turns it on its head. You're going to love this book. It's hilarious. It's lighthearted, and it's really great, entertaining reading. Also, Changeling's Island by Dave Freer, shortlisted this year for the Dragon Award for Best Fantasy, along with Larry Correia and Jim Butcher, and Best YA Book. It's a coming-of-age story full of magic, mystery, creatures of all sorts. It's Changeling's Island by Dave Freer. And then adding this week is B. Brumley with Woe for a Fairy, the first book in the Keepers of New York series. It's a very poetic take on the fairy world. Think City of Angels meets League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and it's a clean read full of great fantasy, but also free of graphic language and explicit sex. If you're looking for an urban fantasy tale, but you don't want all the stuff that comes with it sometimes, check out Woe for a Fairy, The Keepers of New York, Book 1. It's on sale right now for 99 cents through the end of September, so go pick it up. There's a link to all of these books in the show notes. And please let our sponsors know that you thank them and appreciate them supporting the show. Well, thanks for joining me for another episode of the Author Stories Writers Workshop. These have been so much fun to do, and one of the main things that I love about this show is I get to just sit down with a couple of friends of mine, and we just talk about the craft and why we love doing what we do so much. Today, I'm very pleased to have David Bruns on the show with me. David has been on Author Stories a couple of times. I'm a huge fan of his writing. He and J.R. Olson have been on a couple of times, and he's been on once to talk about his Apocalypse Weird book. So David has a new project that he's working on, a new space opera, and he's going to talk about that. And then I also have my old podcasting buddy and geek brother Chris Pourteau on the show with me as well. So welcome to the show, fellas.
Thanks for having us, Hank.
Thanks for having us, Hank.
So, David, I want to start with you. Which story are you bringing to the table today, and give us a little introduction to that story?
Sure. The book is called Invincible, and it is published in Kindle World. It's part of Nick Webb's Legacy Fleet series. So Nick is, I think the technical term is sold a bajillion copies of his Legacy Fleet trilogy, Constitution, Warrior, and Victory. And they are true space opera, alien invasion type stuff. And he opened up the basic premise to the series is that there was an alien invasion of Earth 75 years ago, and Earth is now has moved ahead technologically, and there's this fleet of older ships from the first Swarm War called the Legacy Fleet. As luck would have it, when the Swarm strikes again, the only ships that even stand a chance are the old battle wagons. So the Legacy Fleet comes to the rescue. Now, Nick opened this up to Kindle Worlds a couple of months ago, and I was lucky enough to get one of the earlier slots. So my novel released on September 15th. And what I decided to write, and I dragged Chris into this project with me, what I decided to write was about the first Swarm War, which is about how the Legacy Fleet became the Legacy Fleet. So it's great because you have the constraints and the backing of the Legacy Fleet readership, but you also have a little bit of a more open sandbox to play in terms of creating new characters, because it was 75 years earlier, so almost everybody wasn't even born yet who's in Nick's books.
Nice. What constitutes space opera, first off? Maybe there's a listener out there who's like, I don't understand all these crazy subgenres and stuff. What does space opera mean?
Yeah, I think we could spend a whole hour on that. My definition of it would be big, broad stories that have primarily a space setting.
Okay.
Usually, it involves big fleet battles and alien civilizations. I contributed to a anthology a couple of months ago, and I actually looked it up because I wanted to be sure what space opera was, and basically it said there are many definitions, but basically it's big stories told in space.
Gotcha. So kind of think the scale of epic fantasy, but in space.
Yeah,
big stories,
Wars,
big battles.
Battlestar Galactica. Big, wide open, sprawling stories that are told in space. Yes.
Gotcha. Had you tackled space opera before?
My first sci-fi series had space elements, but I don't think I would call it space opera.
Yeah.
I would call it more sci-fi fantasy. But certainly the sublight travel and all those kinds of things were in there. So I mean, I guess you could sort of shoehorn it in there. I think to me what separates space opera apart is that the main focus of space opera is the space part, and it's exploration and colonization and alien invasions and that kind of stuff. I don't know whether Chris has a better definition. Hopefully he's had a chance to Google it by now.
No, I'm right with you. That sounds about right.
David, have you always been a fan of science fiction and especially space-bound science fiction?
Yeah, I would say my most favoriteest book ever is Dune by Frank Herbert. I mean, it was one of those books where you read it and it's like mind blown. I mean, I can't believe that this guy created this entire universe that's totally unlike our own, but yet very relatable to our own. Right. And I still reread that book every, 3 or 4 years. And I've tried to get all my kids to read it. They will not do it.
You didn't show them the movie instead, did you?
No.
Okay, good.
We don't do that in our house.
Okay,
if you want to see the movie, you got to read the book first.
There you go. I knew you were a great father. I knew you were. Well, when getting into this book, you chose to go back in time and tell some of the origin story. Was that a lot of fun to? Because it seems like you got a pretty wide open sandbox because you're telling a prequel, so to speak. Was that difficult? Did you feel any constraints, even though the story you're telling had really only been alluded to? But was it hard to get into someone else's world, even peripherally?
Not really. I mean, I actually kind of like the constraints aspects of it. So I've written like fan fiction for Michael Bunker's Pennsylvania and a couple of other things. I find that actually the constraints help the creative process for me because it gives you some boundary conditions to work with. Probably the biggest one in this is that, and in Nick's books, and keep in mind these are 75 years in the future from where we're starting.
Right.
You know very little about what the swarm are. I mean, they come and they have these huge ships and they do intense devastation, but he doesn't really reveal what they are until pretty late in the series. I mean, I think it's well into the third book before you get a real clear definition, which means that you can't give any of that stuff away in my book because they don't know it yet, right?
Right.
So those constraints actually make it kind of fun, but at the same time, it gives you guideposts to work with. The wide open part is the names of the ships, sort of the armaments that they have, what they can and can't do. A little bit, you can start to play with sort of the lineage of some of the main characters that come later, and Chris does this quite a bit in his. So you could have like somebody's grandmother appear in your novel, which is a main character in Nick Webb's novel.
Nice. At the time that we're recording this, on September 22nd, your book, The Legacy Fleet Invincible, is the #1 science fiction and fantasy book in Kindle Worlds. That's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, so the really nice part about writing in Kindle Worlds is that Nick comes with a built-in audience. So he's got a legion of fans who really want to read this stuff. Kindle Worlds, unfortunately, is not available internationally. So we have to give ARCs to international readers. So they can't buy it, but ironically, they can actually leave a review in the U.S. Go figure.
That's great. That's great.
It does leave a fraction or a portion of his international readership in the dark, but it's for U.S. and especially for writers. I mean, Nick has been very generous about opening this up and sharing a little bit of the limelight with guys like me.
That's incredible, and it also is ranked in the top 100 in a couple of science fiction and fantasy subcategories that are not in Kindle World. So it's trending pretty high overall in the Kindle store. So congratulations on that.
It's doing really well. I'm really happy about it, and I think every time Nick launches something, it goes a little bit higher. So I mean, Chris is coming in a couple months, and so he should be #1 in the store, I think, by that.
Oh yeah,
I think so too.
Thanks, man. Thanks.
So speaking of Chris Pourteau, Chris, I'm Pourteau. Pourteau, excuse me.
Right.
Excuse me. You Cajuns, what can I say?
Texan boy.
Texan. Tell us about your story that you're bringing today.
Okay, so if to talk about a story that's got a little bit of legs to it, like David's novel is just fresh on the market and doing really well. But I wrote a story about 1.5 years ago, almost 2 years ago now, called Unconditional. It was a short story, and I wrote it in November, December of 2014. And the premise of the story, really quickly, is it's the incredible journey, the old Disney movie of the animals, the adventure from the perspective of the animals. It's the incredible journey meets the Walking Dead, and the premise of the story is the zombie apocalypse happens, and the family dog literally is left out in the cold and has to gnaw its way gnaw itself out of the rope that it was tied to, and goes on a search for the family that was run out of their house by the zombie apocalypse.
2 years ago? Has it really been that long?
Almost. It was November of 2014 because we launched Tales of the Apocalypse, which was sort of inspired by the reaction to that story in November of 2015. So yeah,
that is insane.
Yeah,
that's crazy. Yeah. Wow. So where did the idea for that story come from?
Okay, so I was on Facebook, as I am wont to be during the day, and our good friend Stefan Boltz, who was on your last episode with Nick Cole, had posted a picture of his dog Ember, and the dog was standing in the middle of a road. There were leaves everywhere. It was in the fall. He'd taken the picture and just posted it that day on Facebook. It was in the fall. And there were leaves everywhere. The road was, it looked like one of those extended perspective shots that you see, especially, and this is what hit me, it looked like one of those shots from The Walking Dead where you see this long shot up this empty road, and the whole point is, humanity's gone, there's nobody driving on the road. It's this very lonely, isolated feeling you get from the shot. And Ember was standing in the middle of the road in her harness, looking up the road, standing amidst the leaves. And it looked like she was looking for something, like she was searching for something. And so immediately the basis for the story just kind of came together like really, really quickly in my head. And that's like, what would the zombie apocalypse be from the perspective of the family dog? And she ended up in the story, she's looking for her boy. She and her boy are very close, the boy of the family that she's a part of. And I thought, okay, she's looking for something. She's lost her boy. The boy's been taken by the zombies or whatever, run off by the zombies, whatever's happened. And that's where it came from. It came inspired by Stefan's picture on Facebook. And I said, hey, man, can I have that for my story cover? And he said, sure. And I handed that to E.E. Georgie, also a mutual friend of ours. And I said, could you please make me a cover out of this? Because I'm inept when it comes to graphic design. And she said, sure. And so I wrote the story and I put the cover on it and published it in, I think it was January of 2015, actually, that I published it. But I was writing it over the Christmas holidays.
If I remember right, and it's been a couple of years, but that story came together pretty quickly, didn't it?
Yeah. I think I wrote it over the Christmas break that year. I work for the state of Texas, and we get an extended Christmas holiday of about 10 to 12 days, depending on how the calendar works out. And that's what I spent my Christmas holidays doing.
When you saw the photo and it gave you this feeling and this sort of the kernel of the idea came to you, as I like to say, that I think stories usually begin and then they grow and grow like a seed. Did you envision how the story was going to end from the beginning, or did you just say, you know what, I think there's a story here, and then just start writing and the story comes about?
I think I knew how it was going to end. And it wasn't going to be a Disney ending. I mean, that's the thing about the story is that, yeah, it is not okay. They're laughing, people, because they've read the story and they know the ending. So it wasn't going to be a happy Disney kind of ending. So I knew that, and I knew how it was going to start, because how does every zombie story start? The zombies show up, right, and humanity falls.
Yeah. Everything
in the middle I made up as I went along. So that's how that came together.
And that story was very well received. I know that when you published it, people. Well, I know when you first started sending it out to beta readers, you were getting some pretty phenomenal feedback from people. I was one of them. That story just completely blew me away.
I think your reaction was pretty indicative of everybody that reads the story, which is something like, "God, that's an awesome story, you son of a bitch."
Yeah, I think that may have been my exact words.
No, I'm serious.
Yeah.
That's what I tell her. I say, okay, when you read this, this might be your reaction. Not to prejudge your, that you're going to love the story or whatever. But if you like the story, you're also going to call me a son of a bitch. So.
Right. Which is an average Thursday, but
if I'm lucky. Yeah.
Oh man. So that story, you released it. You got a ton of feedback. People loved it. People started buying it. And it was very well received. So well received, that you had the idea to curate an anthology built around this idea and invited a bunch of authors in, David and I included. And that went on to get a whole lot of other people, in their fields as well. So that's very rarely do we ever envision something we do kind of taking on a whole other life like that. When you began this story, did you have any idea it would resonate so deeply with people, and then encourage other people to, dream up as twisted stories as you did and contribute?
Don't mince words, Bones. What do you really think? I quote Star Trek often. No, in fact, I was kind of scared to publish the story because here's what I thought was going to happen. I thought when I was writing it, I was like, this isn't going to have a happy ending. This isn't going to have a happy ending. People are going to hate it. People are going to hate me. I'm going to get a bunch of 1 stars, and my reputation's going to go in the toilet. And I was like, well, but this is honestly where the story needs to go. This is what the story is. It just is. Sometimes life isn't happy and sunny. It's just, the way it is. So I was kind of afraid to publish the damn thing. I really thought I was going to get a bunch of negative reviews just because it didn't have a happy American movie ending, But no, I had no idea. Well, after it kind of I was like, oh, people are reacting well to it. This is kind of what I was going for. Wow. Okay, cool. Then I got the idea of doing an anthology around the same kind of theme, and that not that dog in the zombie apocalypse necessarily, but different animals in different apocalyptic scenarios. And I asked, you guys and other folks and specific people like Ed Robertson has a very, very popular series of apocalyptic novels called the Breaker series. And so I asked people like him, I was like, look, you've already got an established world. What about writing an animal story set in that world? It doesn't necessarily have to be from the animal's perspective, but an animal should be a prominent character. What about doing that? He's like, yeah, and Michael Bunker and Nicole and other people that E. Georgie and her Mayaki Chronicles. So got a bunch of people together, and we ended up benefiting a great organization called Pets for Vets that David Bruns actually table, a national organization that pairs up shelter dogs with I was going to say Wounded Warriors. That's a different project, with veterans who have like PTSD and other emotional trauma. And we gave them a nice check last January. And so that was a really nice outcome for the whole anthology idea. And the anthology's been very well received too. I mean, it's the same kind of thing. Wow, never thought of these different dystopian scenarios from the point of view of the animals. It's always from the point of view of the humans. So the anthology was received in very much the same spirit, positive spirit that the original story was received. And so I thought that was a nice way to sort of bring the circle, everything full circle.
Yeah. Do you feel like that as you practice your craft more, and you become more adept at storytelling and more comfortable with your tool set and just getting the words under your belt and getting more accomplished at what you do you find it easier to tell those hard stories that don't necessarily wrap up nicely at the end and there's a happy ending? I know for me the more I write and the more comfortable I become, the easier it is for me to have a tragic ending or to really go to a dark place that I might not have been ready to do or able to do early on because I felt like I needed to wrap this up and to not let people down. Do you feel like that's something that comes with just maturity and growth as a writer?
Yeah, I don't know if it's related to craft or just becoming more confident in your ability to know where the story needs to go within the story's own set of whatever those criteria are that make it the story that it is. If you've got a story that like just take Unconditional, for example, where it's not going to have necessarily a happy ending. I would, as I explained, I was very reluctant to go there because I thought, well, even if that's where the story needs to go, the public's not going to like it or whatever. The people that read it aren't going to like it. And now I'm more confident in just saying, well, but this is, and I did it then too, but I wasn't confident about it. Now I can say, well, this is where the story needs to go. It just is. And if people don't like it, that's okay. It's still, not everybody looks at a piece of art and sees the same thing. So I'm more confident in just saying this is where I'm going with the story because that's where it needs to go than I was a year and a half ago for sure. Yeah.
Let's switch gears just a little bit for a minute. David, this project, the Legacy Fleet project, and your new book, Invincible. You had a deadline for this book. You needed to have the book finished at a particular time because a lot of the authors that are involved in this Kindle Worlds project that you told us about, you guys are staging these releases at right. certain times. So you needed to fit this into a structure. And we already talked about that you had an existing world to work with. How did you go about taking the story idea that you had, but then working through that to completion? I know that when I've talked to you and J.R. Olson, you guys were pretty heavy outliners and you worked together and you really needed to be organized because you were sharing right. writing duties. But this was just you alone, but you had a structure to work within. How did you approach setting up the project so that you ensured your own success?
Yeah, so the Chris and I actually agreed early on that we were going to write a 2-book series. So I'm writing the first book in this first Swarm War series, and he's writing the second one. So it's a little bit of a co-authorship type arrangement now because I have to pass something off to him that he can use, right? So if I wrap all the plot lines up at the end, then he's got nothing to work with. so
and then Bobby comes out of the shower and the whole year is gone.
Right. If I defeat the aliens once and for all, then Chris has no battles left to fight. So because we thought of this idea fairly early on. So the way I started was I had the idea for this first Swarm War series. I had a couple of characters, and I started writing out just a long form sort of stream of consciousness. 1 page. The story starts here, it goes here. We're going to introduce this guy. We're going to have a big battle scene here. I would send that back and forth to Chris. I mean, once I had probably, I guess, a 2-page treatment. I'm pretty broad brush, but sort of the general overview of we're going to start here, we're going to end here, and this is the kind of major milestones within. I sat down and wrote out a scene list because I knew how long it needed to be, and I wanted to make sure I had 30 to 40 chapters to work with because this is sort of an action novel, so you're going to have the chapters are going to be shorter. And I knew that going in. So, I was thinking probably 1,000 to 1,500 words a chapter, certainly no more than 2,000 words, which means if I wanted to drop a 50,000 word novel, I needed to have 35 to 45-ish chapters, right? So I started writing out a scene list, and that helps me put down, who's the point of view, sort of what they want out of each, and that, runs out to maybe 3-4 pages. And I write from that. I sort of keep a character list as I go along because you want to make sure that the guys whose eyes are blue in chapter 1, his eyes are still blue in chapter 6.
Unless he's been like infected.
Yes, exactly.
Oh.
And I wrote from that. And so I think the more I write, the more I appreciate outlining. In that it just enables me to go a little bit faster, and it just makes the process more efficient. So I approach novel writing and short story writing differently. I mean, for me, a short story has to be, I need to know the beginning, the middle, and the end, and the story arc and how I'm going to tie all the pieces off before I start. Because otherwise it just sort of winds and goes all over the place, and you just don't have space for that within a short story. And I find that now my scenes are more like little short stories almost, in that when I sit down to write a scene, and I write chronologically, I write from chapter 1 to chapter 50. I know other people say write the climactic scene first. I just don't do that, because I got the story running in my head, and this is how it has to fit together. But I approach like each scene, which is usually a chapter, each scene as sort of a mini short story. I mean, it's got to have an arc to it. It's got a single point of view. It's got an action. It's got a point, and then we're going to go to the next scene.
You talked about people that write climactic scenes first, and then fill the story in around it. That is so bizarre to me. I could not imagine writing that way.
Me too.
Stephen Pressfield talks about it quite a bit, and he talks about writing the hardest scene you think you're going to have to write that first. And there's two reasons why I couldn't do it that way. One is that while I have an outline of a scene, sort of how that character grows as the story grows will impact what that scene looks like.
Exactly. Yes.
But I mean, I just think of a story in terms of I read for many years before I started writing, and that's how books are, right? I mean, you start at chapter 1 and you go to chapter 50. You don't read chapter 50 and say, "Oh, that's how they resolved it." Yeah. So I mean, I write like a reader. Of this is when I want to introduce it. This is how I want to introduce it, and I'm going to link this to chapter 4. But I haven't written chapter 4 yet, so I'm going to have to go back and make sure that these two things are well connected.
And I just want to point something out. This is why I think David and I like each other's writing so much. Not to put words in his mouth, but I think we admire each other's writing quite a bit, because we both focus on character, and the motivations of the character drive the plot and the action. It's not the other way around.
Right.
And so, how can you write chapter 13 where the man commits the crime that's going to turn that the novel turns on, until you know the man, and you don't know the man until you've written the first 12 chapters,
Yeah. Well, Diana Gabaldon, when she was on Author Stories, said that she writes scenes just completely out of order, that she just, kind of daydreams about these characters, and she kind of writes down what they're doing, and then she organizes them later. And I'm not an in-depth outliner. But to me, that's completely the other end of the spectrum. I could not function that way. I'm like you guys. I need to know the character, know what they want. I need to know what their struggles and their hurdles are, and then I need to watch them grow through the situation. And I'm just kind of dictating what they do. But until I've watched them go through that, I have no idea what they're going to do.
Exactly. The way I describe my process is that I'm a court transcriptionist. Okay. And things are happening in front of me, and people are speaking in my head, and all I'm doing is typing it out. I'm just transcribing, and I go back and clean it up later in editing. But David inspired me, and so I'm writing the second book. It's called Avenger, the sequel to Invincible. And he inspired me in two ways. First of all, he knocked out his novel in like a month, which is crazy fast to me. And second of all...
Well, it's because he's a professional, Chris.
He's a professional who's retired from the Navy and has time to write every day.
We're ignoring that part. Okay, right. He's a professional.
He made the deal. He was at the crossroads with Satan, and we know the story.
Right. Right.
But also his outline, which we went back and forth on. I did the same thing. I said, okay, I'm gonna outline this 30-chapter sequel. And shared that with him to make sure everything was going to jibe between the two novels. But the thing that I've discovered about outlining, which I never really did before I had to write on deadline, is that it gives you something to write, and it gives you, they talk to you, they say you should write something every day. You should write every day. You should write every day, which I do for the most part when I'm on deadline, like with this novel. But it gives me what I'm going to write for the day. You
Yeah.
know, I've already
Yeah.
prefabricated that, so I know where I'm going to go.
Well, it gives you a writing prompt
Exactly.
every day.
Yes, exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
And I've read some of your outlines, Chris, and they definitely are kind of like writing prompts, and kind of like what David was talking about earlier. Like I know some of yours that I've seen in the past are kind of like a scene list with a little, just kind of an important point, and that just gives you a prompt to then craft that whole scene around it.
Right. Exactly.
Is that kind of what your idea is?
And if you ever read my outlines, you'll see they're all generated around characters. So, you know, Sam walks into the
Right.
bar and he gets into a fight because blah, 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 blah. It doesn't say man walks into a bar and gets into a fight. It's Sam that walks into the bar, and Sam is a particular character, you know, etc. So,
Right. David, I'm sorry, you were trying to say just a second ago.
So I think one of the reasons why Stephen Pressfield talks about this is he's a guy who wrote The War of Art and Legend of Bagger Vance, and he's written a lot on the craft of writing, and he's coined the term. I don't know whether he's coined it or it's been associated with him, but the term resistance, which is another word for writer's block. But one of the reasons I think why he wants people to attack that hardest scene first is because you can sort of knock that out of the way in terms of a reason why you're not going to start in the first place. If you're coming at a project and you're determined to do the project and you've got a plan, resistance is lessened than if you're sort of trying to get the momentum to get the project started. I also think that there's probably a difference in how much rewriting you have to do. I mean, if I wrote the climactic scene of the novel, I could probably do it, but I'm sure as hell would have to do a lot of rewriting once I got to that point within the narrative. And so, I mean, Diana Gabaldon probably does a ton of rewriting, but at the same time, she might catch the essence of that scene that's in her head at that moment that she can, put down, and she can use that as raw material once she gets to that part of the book. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sure that it's something like that. I'm sure that she, to her, that may be like a grand outlining.
Yeah.
You wind up with all of this material, and then you put it together, and then you're actually writing the book. Then you're taking all the things you discovered and making a narrative out of it. I would be willing to bet that that's how it actually looks. It sounds less romantic, but I bet that's how it actually works. Most writers have read Stephen King's book on writing, and a lot of people, love to share on Facebook, the little nuggets that they get from Stephen King, and it's a fantastic book, and I think we've all read it and gotten a lot out of it. But Stephen King, in that book, is very anti-outlining. And he makes the point that if you outline a book, then when you go to write it, you've already written the book, and who wants to do that?
Define
and,
outline. I mean, three sentences that describe a chapter times 30 chapters is not a book written.
Well, and that's what I wanted to get at with you guys is, I think all three of us here, kind of straddle that fence in that we. I know I don't, and I know you don't, Chris. Don't write a point-by-point outline, but it's more of a roadmap. Have you ever written? Have you ever tried to write with a very strict outline and a very granular outline, like I know some people do, Chris?
Probably the most strict outline I've used is the one I'm using for Avenger, the sequel novel. And it's not very strict. It's like 3 sentences per chapter that says this is what's going to happen, and then next chapter. And in fact, I'm 2/3 of the way through the novel. I always write my novel in thirds, even if they're not divided that way. In the format. And so I'm 2/3 of the way through Avenger, and I'm going to have to rewrite the third of the outline. Because some of the things that I said were going to happen didn't happen, and some of the things that have happened have changed what's going to happen in the third part. So now I have to rewrite the third part of the outline. But I think that's kind of an interesting it kind of looks at your point from an interesting perspective, and that is, yes, I wrote an outline, and yes, I kind of knew where I was going, but the story was organic at the same time. And so now I'm going to have to replot the third part of the novel, and it's not going to be that big a deal, but I'm not going to start chapter 21 exactly where I had outlined it.
What is it with you and thirds? Have you ever...
Look, man,
is it something you consciously do?
Years in therapy dealing with thirds. You know what? I'll tell you what it is, and I'm also this way about chapters. Like my first novel had 3 parts with 7 chapters each. My second novel had 3 parts with 7 chapters each. This book has 3 parts with 10 chapters each. The numbers.
Your programming is slipping.
Anybody that knows me knows I'm anal retentive, and the numbers.
Yes. No.
The numbers give me comfort. They make me comfortable enough to then do whatever the hell I want to do in the chapter. There's something going on there to that effect.
Well, and whatever trick or whatever that right, we're a superstitious bunch, whether we want to admit it or not. We are. We want things to be just right, and we can even say, I don't hold my writing space precious. I can take my laptop wherever and just but you definitely want to have your coffee a certain way, and right. We're a superstitious bunch, so whether we admit it or not, we probably all have little routines and things like that just ease the comfort level down a little bit and allow us to get into that creative space.
And I'm an organizer. I like to be organized, so I could feel organized with 3 parts with 7 chapters each, and that gives me leeway to just do whatever I want as I'm writing. It's I don't know. It's a neurosis. I know that.
Well, we all have them. David, do you have any particular tools or any things that you have discovered in your writing that make it easier for you? Maybe a way of outlining, a way of collecting notes, or maybe a particular way that you draft your novel. Are there any things that you've learned that have helped you?
No, I do use Scrivener, which I think is a godsend because it enables you to break down a novel pretty quickly. But I tend to be pretty impatient. Yeah. I mean, when I get an outline started and when I get the story sort of rolling in my head, I want to jump in. So I actually have to hold myself back from writing until I've got a reasonably complete outline. And like Chris, I mean, I was kind of chuckling because I will also rewrite the outline as I'm going along because something that I thought would take 1 chapter takes 2 chapters. Right. Or there's other cool things that I think up along the way. But I tend to be a little bit anxious about getting started, and I'm a terrible note taker because I have horrible handwriting, and I have not come up with a good way to organize notes online. And I've tried different kinds of things, but I end up really with, basically a Microsoft Word document with, it's a couple pages long with a narrative, and I print it out actually, and I bring it with me, and I head to a coffee shop, and I'm saying I'm doing, 3,000 words today or 2 chapters or whatever it is, and I just sit down and gut it out until it's done. And sometimes it takes 2 hours, and sometimes it takes a lot more than 2 hours.
Do you ever get ideas just at random places or times and have to jot those down so you don't forget them? Yeah. Do you have a way that you collect those ideas?
The best way, I mean, I've tried different programs on my phone and stuff, and it just never seems to work. I usually send an email to myself that says, space salvager comes across, drifting ship that has, robot AI has killed the crew or something. And then, the next morning I open up my email, I'm like, what the hell does that mean?
I do that too. I'll send myself emails, and then when I get home or wherever, I'll pull my laptop out, and I have a Scrivener project that has just all of these story ideas in them, and none of them are fully formed by any means. They look like the ramblings of a psychotic person because I'll write down trigger words in it that things that will trigger that story back to me. And I know if anybody ever pulls my laptop open, they're going to be like, "Yeah, he's planning something."
He needs to be
tell
committed.
this.
Yeah. You know, I'll,
Yeah. When I get to the point, and I've been doing quite a bit of short fiction this year, and what I will do is when I get to the point where I have an idea that I think is actually an idea worth pursuing, I'll actually open up a Google Docs page on it, and I'll just start to throw stuff in there as things come to me until I get to the point where I can write a one paragraph narrative that says, this happens to this person, and describe the entire story arc. Again, going back to the idea of constraints, I've done a couple of anthologies, and I find that works well for me. If I have a deadline that's, let's say it's a couple of weeks or a month away, and I'll usually announce at dinner time to my family, hey, I have to write a space opera about whatever, short story, and they'll start just lobbing all kinds of stuff in, space chickens and all kinds of things. But inevitably from that discussion will come an idea or two, and I'll write the idea or two, and I'll let it percolate, and then when it becomes a scene in my head or the basis of a story, I'll put a Google Docs page on it, and then I'll just start adding stuff until I have enough until the story kind of clicks.
Right.
Again, short stories for me are very different than novels, because short stories are about a moment, and until I know what the moment is, whether it's the beginning or at the end or the middle, until I know what the moment is, I can't really write the story because it's just going to wander around and not do anything. So, go ahead.
I'm glad you brought that up, because both of you guys are phenomenal short story writers as well as novelists. But and I know you alluded to this a little earlier, David, when you said that your process is different for writing a short story than a piece of long fiction. But what specifically do you guys do differently when you're approaching maybe a piece that's 5 to 10,000 words as opposed to a piece that's 50 to 100,000 words? Just kind of what's the logical first steps that you have to go through to kind of get the story set in your mind?
You want to go first, Chris, or you want me to?
Sure. Honestly, there's not a whole lot of difference for me, and that's probably going to be against what 9 out of 10 people tell you. But the only thing I would say that's different, because everything for me is driven by character, as I said, the only thing that's different for me is scope. So, and I'm having a little bit of that problem right now. I'm writing a short story for the Legacy Fleet, second Legacy Fleet collection of short stories that's going to come out under the Future Chronicles banner.
Right.
And the range is 5,000 to 8,000 words. And I'm going to be butting up against that 8,000 words for sure. Because there's a lot of story to tell the idea that I came up with. It's not, I wouldn't say broad, but it's got multiple characters in it. There's a lot going on, and so you have to fit it into this little container, and so you start having to shave here and shave there, and I haven't gotten to that point yet. But really, there's nothing other than scope. Like it has to be focused and finite, because for me, again, it's all about character. So they can't be flying at sublight speed from Earth to Jupiter, because you don't have enough space. You don't have enough runway in the story. So it has to be, you have to get them where they're going, they get involved in the adventure or whatever's going on, and then you start exploring what's going on with the characters within that space, and it just has to be, the scope has to be smaller. That's the only difference I see for me.
Okay. What about you, David?
So I've been writing short fiction, I don't know, for about 3 years or so, and I noticed, and I kept finding this over and over again, I noticed I was having trouble with endings. I would have a rather abrupt ending, and I'd show it to somebody, my crit group, my wife, and they say, you got a good story here, but it's not finished. And I really struggled with it. And I ended up taking a short story course from Mary Robinette Cole called Short Story Intensive. It's a weekend online course, and it is intensive. It starts on Friday night, and it goes like, it goes from Friday night from like 7 to 11, and then all day on Saturday and most of the day on Sunday. And she introduced me to, and she didn't invent this, but she teaches. It's called the MICE system, and MICE stands for four different elements: milieu, idea, character, event. And basically, she gives you it's not a formula, but it's a structure for writing a short story, which is you need to introduce one of those elements, whether it's a setting, whether it's an idea, whether it's a character, whether it's an event, and you need to introduce that, and you need to close it at the end. And within that, you should probably have one other. It's not a subplot, but it's like a sub-event, right?
Right.
And so the space of 5,000-6,000 words means you can only have so many characters, means you can only have so many scenes rather, and you can only have so many elements, because otherwise it just gets out of control. And that's really the biggest issue, I think, with short stories, is you need to naturally constrain yourself. And once I started using that and really thinking in those terms, my ability as a short story writer, I think, went up a lot, because I was able to correctly scope and identify the short story parameters around the story at the beginning, rather than write something that was too long or wandered or whatever, and then have to go back and say, okay, what has to go to get this, below 10,000 words? So and the same ideas apply in terms of introducing things and closing them within novels, but the scope is so much broader because you've got so much more canvas to work with. So that's actually why I like writing short stories now, is because it forces you to neck down the idea and neck down the thing until you're just talking about what you want to talk about without all the extraneous stuff around it.
David, it sounds like from what you said earlier, you've kind of backward engineered the way you write your novels that way too, because you described your chapter writing as if you're writing a short story, a connected series of short stories sort of becomes a novel.
Yeah. So I think chapters naturally go that way because, a scene needs to have a beginning, middle, and an end. It needs to have a payoff in it. I mean, the scene needs to both move the plot and or the character forward. It can't just be, a couple of guys having dinner, the dreaded having coffee scene, right? Where you're dumping all this information out without anything happening. So it's definitely helps. I treat the outlines and the scenes as more like a writing prompt. So I'm not as worried about them having a structure to them, but it's certainly it's sort of like boundary conditions, I guess, when I start writing, and I just pulled up my scene list here, and chapter number 1, scene 1 was First Officer Elaine Cornwell, whose the point of view was woken up from stasis 2 days early, and it gives 2 sentences about what she finds, and then it tells what the punchline is at the end of that, or what the big reveal is at the end of that chapter. And that was what I wanted to have happen. Now the whole chapter is 1,500 words. I mean, this is like 30 words, but it just outlines the basic starting point, the writing prompt, and then I go from there.
I think it's really important to write short fiction and to sprinkle that in with your longer fiction, because it really does, and like you said, and Chris, you were talking about David reverse engineering his writing. It really forces you to get down to the heart of the matter, and to really get down to what you're trying to say, to really showing the depth of character without all of the superfluous stuff that goes along with it. I heard who's the guy that wrote The Notebook? What's his name? Nicholas Sparks. He talked about that in writing The Notebook. He said there was a long chapter about the main protagonist. He goes off to war, and he had a book of poetry that he carried with him. And he said that there was like this whole chapter about him and this book of poetry and all of this stuff. And he kept trimming it down, trying to get down to the heart of the matter. And there was a scene where the protagonist gets shot in the war, but the book of poetry blocks the bullet. And this, this whole thing, but he kept whittling it down and whittling it down and whittling it down he got it down to one sentence. And, the one sentence was something like, that he talked about the book and he said, and the book even took a bullet for me. And he was able to trim all that down and get it down to just what needed to be said about it. And I think short fiction, especially for a novelist, I think that is a great exercise to learn to cut out all the unnecessary stuff and get right down to the heart of the matter.
Well, and I think one of the things that some writers don't think about, and David earlier said, I write like a reader.
Yeah.
Because, from the front, he was talking literally from front to back, but I would expand that definition a little bit and say, I write like a reader. I write like I would want to read the book. Yeah. In other words, when I write something or when I edit something, actually, I'm like, is this necessary? Is this going to mean something to the reader? Is this going to bore the crap out of the reader? Is this boring the crap out of me? And I subscribe to Poe's philosophy of composition as a short story writer. And the essence of that is everything in the story, format, language, character, everything should be dedicated to one purpose, and that is to evoke emotional response in the reader. And I try to do that more successfully than other times. But it's all about evoking something in the person that reads the story. I mean, Unconditional was a good example of that I got lucky with that, I think. But it's what does the reader need to get what you want them to get out of this story? And some writers, I don't think, ask themselves that question, because they'll go on for pages and pages and pages about how dilapidated that suitcase looks. And I could really care less, man.
But it meant something to them. Yeah.
To them, but they're writing for themselves.
Right, exactly.
They're not writing for the reader.
Exactly.
And I think that short fiction has gotten a little bit of a renaissance with digital publishing.
Oh, absolutely.
I know. I mean, 20 years ago, the only way you were going to read short fiction was if you subscribed to one of the few magazines, or you bought a book of short fiction, which most people didn't buy because publishers didn't really publish all that many.
Or it was assigned to you in a literature class.
Right, you got it in school,
right?
And so I tended not to read a lot of short fiction because I associated it with class,
right?
And it was only when I started reading some of the anthologies. This is 3, 4, 5 years ago. Some of the anthologies coming out digitally, that I started to realize that I was really kind of missing. I had been stunted, I think, as a reader, because you're reading sort of canon stuff, which is good, but they're not interspersing it with other things that's not canon stuff. So you tend to associate short stories with, Eudora Welty or something, which is a wonderful writer, but you got to be in the mood for that, right?
Right. Or you have to be from Mississippi. That's Eudora Welty's required.
But I think this is a perfect time for short stories, because our attention span has gotten so much shorter. And who has time to sit around all weekend reading the latest, Stephen King novel? I wish I did, but I'm a slow reader. I read at the pace at which, if I were reading the novel out loud to you, that's the pace I read. And so finding the time to complete a novel, it takes me weeks, but I can knock out a short story and beginning, middle, end, and have some kind of emotional response to the story, hopefully, in a couple of hours. So I think it's a perfect time for short stories.
Yeah.
Guys, we're running up on an hour, and I want to thank y'all for your time. But before we go, since this is a writer's workshop show and we are focusing on the craft of writing, what I've been asking my guests on the show to do as we wrap up is I would like each one of you to give one piece of writing advice to another writer. And a writing prompt, anything in the world, just something that will evoke something in someone else and give them something to bounce a story idea off of. So, Chris, I'll start with you.
Okay, advice: write for the reader. In other words, if you want to write for yourself, that's fine. But if you want to be successful, I think you have to take into account, does this matter? What I'm putting on the page, is this moving the plot forward? Is this character somebody that people are going to want to read about? Write for the reader. Write for yourself as a reader, but write for the reader. As far as a prompt goes, all right, you're walking through a park. You see a woman sitting on a bench. She's wearing one of those professional sort of pantsuits with the jacket. She's kind of slumped, but she's awake. She's alive, but she's kind of slumped. Her hair is a little bit disheveled. What do you think she's thinking?
That's evocative. Okay, David, what about you?
So, in terms of advice, what I would say is finish what you're working on. I mean, I've met so many people who are writing a novel or even writing a short story, and they're constantly going back and reworking the first 2 chapters instead of writing chapter 15 or 16 or 17. And once you get that draft as good as you can get it, finish the first draft, but then take it to the next step. Get someone to edit it for you, and if you're confident, publish it. What I found going through this is that you're really only going to get better if you go all the way through the process. I've met so many people who have workshopped the hell out of the first 3 chapters of their book, but they haven't finished the book.
Right.
And to me, that's sort of a crying shame, because the first 3 chapters are not a book. A writing prompt. Geez, I am looking out my window right now at an empty lacrosse goal with a torn net, and that would be my writing prompt.
Zombie apocalypse.
Alien invasion. Okay. That great advice. Finish what you start. There's I don't believe in the concept of aspiring writers. I think you're either a writer or you're not. And the thing that makes you a writer is finishing what you start. Get out there and finish. David Bruns, right now your new book, Legacy Fleet Invincible, is available for purchase right now on Amazon.com. I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes. Chris, also your story, Unconditional, A Tale of the Zombie Apocalypse, which then birthed the Tales of the Apocalypse. I'll put a link to both of those in the show notes. Thank you guys for joining me today.
Hey, thank you.